Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, podcast listeners of all ages and stages, welcome to episode 74 of the Jolly Thoughts podcast. 74, it's a nice number. This conversation is about a book, and it's about a book that is called The Thing That Would Make Everything Okay Forever. Transcendence, Psychedelics, and Jesus Christ. It's written by Ashley Lande. I tell you what, this book is, it's a page turner, it's a head scratcher, it is interesting. As somebody myself who has been interested and not taken, but interested in psychedelics a little bit for a long time. I mean, I remember watching people take them, when I was in high school and kind of just being like, somewhat, I don't know, put off by it, but also kind of like intrigued. And then a number of years ago now, I read this book by Michael Pollan called How to Change Your Mind. And this is when all of a sudden I started thinking, I mean, have I been wrong? Are psychedelics actually good? And there's been a new renaissance in the psychedelic world. And so I was really helped by being able to hear firsthand experience of somebody who kind of went down the road of psychedelics pretty hard. So to me, this conversation has been helpful. I think it helps integrate for me a number of different strands that I've kind of heard going around in the general population for a while. I hope that you'll find it interesting as well. I feel like there should be a tax placed upon me. Maybe every time I say the word transcendent or transcendence, I should have to throw a quarter in a pot. Definitely overused the word. I should also let you know that this is maybe the first time in a while that I've experienced this level of technical difficulty just on the other end of the line. So Ashley was having some kind of struggles with her computer. So if you're watching the video version of it, you'll see me kind of squinting sometimes because I'm just trying to listen really hard. Hopefully that will be fixed in the post so by the time you hear it. But in case you're wondering why it looks like I'm pondering so heavily. And then also there are about 2 different times where the audio dropped to the point where I had to remove it. So you'll have sections that you'll notice, I think you might notice if you're an astute listener, that they're stitched. Not usually the case. I normally just let it run, but in this instance, it seemed like the thing to do rather than make you squint terribly while you're driving your car or washing your dishes. Those are always the 2 examples I give: driving cars, washing dishes. I actually listen to most of my podcasts while running or walking my dog, but hey, that's enough about me. Let me know what you thought about this conversation. Would love to hear from you. But without any further ado, though, my conversation with Ashley Lande. What is this book? Would you call it a memoir? Would you call it a biography? What would you call this?
I call it a memoir.
A memoir. Okay. And what is it a memoir of?
It's a memoir of my testimony, essentially, of coming to be a believer in Christ. It's a memoir of my years-long foray into psychedelic tripping and trying to find some kind of spiritual enlightenment there, or spiritual end there, and failing to find it, and finally finding it in the place that I really, really, really didn't want to look, which was Christianity.
Right. So, spoiler alerts. All right. Well, then take us back to the beginning, then, Ashley. So you, as you paint kind of beautifully in this book, you kind of your opening section gives us a bit of a window into the onset of what you already described, which is your kind of foray into psychedelics. But obviously, your story starts before that. So, when you were a child, what sort of exposure or whatnot did you have to things like drugs and alcohol and those kinds of things?
Yeah, I really very minimal, pretty much nothing until I was a teenager. There wasn't even any alcohol in our house when I was growing up anyway. It was not, it just really wasn't a part of. My dad was a very heavy smoker, so there was that. He was always smoking his Carlton menthols. And but other than that, I thought that drugs were something that bad people did. I wasn't interested at all. I had an aunt who was a drug addict and sadly took her own life about 15 years ago. And so she was kind of my knowledge of this is what a drug addict looks like. This is how they behave. And she was an alcoholic as well. And I really wanted nothing to do with that. But then when I was a teenager, and I rejected Christianity at that point when I was 14, 15 years old, and was very, I found anything countercultural very alluring. I got really into the beat poets, Jack Kerouac, people like that, Allen Ginsberg, and I just thought it was this whole new exotic world. And they, of course, were very into drugs and psychedelics. And at the high school I went to, there was plenty of drinking, but I wasn't really exposed to it until I was a senior in high school, got drunk for the first time. And I did have some friends who had some marijuana, I think when I was 15, 16. And I tried that. I don't know if I actually got high at that point, but I just was very attracted to the idea of, once I did experience something that, and I guess that first experience with really consciousness alteration would have been with getting drunk on alcohol. I was just very seduced by the idea that like I can take something and change my state of mind. I can take something and experience this loss of inhibition and what felt like freedom at the time. So I'd say that was kind of my entry point, was really probably alcohol.
Okay. And so, I mean, this might be a difficult question to answer because I don't really remember I hardly remember being a teenager, and I really don't remember being a child. But if you think back to that time, was searching for transcendence actually something that was important to you, do you think, at that point in time? Like you mentioned the idea of like you took alcohol to it, and once you had enough of it, all of a sudden, oh, look, I have a different state of mind. Yeah. Was escaping in some respects, was it already something that felt important to you at that point?
Yeah, I think it was. Like I said, just the idea that I could experience a different state of consciousness, a different state of mind was very appealing. I had been a pretty good kid up to that point. You know, I'd always gotten straight A's in school. My older sister, our family dynamics were difficult at that time. My older sister had gotten into a lot of trouble and legal trouble and just all kinds of trouble at school and gotten kicked out, all kinds of things. And so I felt like she had her troubles had kind of eaten up the emotional bandwidth in our family. So I always felt pressure to keep being good. And so I think it was kind of like this pressure valve, you know, to be able to let loose, I guess. Like I said, at the time it felt liberating. It felt good. Of course, I remember the morning after, even though I was just at a friend's house, that first time I got drunk, I was with some of my girlfriends at a friend's house, and you know, so didn't really have the opportunity to do anything spectacularly embarrassing or destructive. But I do remember that feeling that first time, even the next morning, be like, what did I say? Like, wow, I acted really stupid. Like, that was dumb, you know. And of course I had a headache and felt like I wanted to vomit. So yeah.
And you mentioned that whenever this was around 14, 15, I think you said something like you kind of consciously rejected Christianity. Mm-hmm. So was Christianity a part of your childhood upbringing?
It was, yeah, it was. I wouldn't say it was a huge part or a really integrated part of my childhood. My mother was I should say, she's finally left the Methodist Church, but she was a third or fourth generation Methodist. And so that was kind of what she knew. And so we went to a Methodist church, and of course Methodism has become a pretty liberal denomination. My dad was not for that, but he was also really busy with his business, and so he would come sometimes. But I would say, like I said, it wasn't really, Christianity was not an integrated part of my childhood. I never read the Bible, we didn't pray together. It was just kind of this underlying assumption that, well, yeah, there's a God, you know, he's out there somewhere. I don't think I had a sense of God acting in my life or having really an active role in how I conducted myself or it just was this underlying assumption, like, yes, God exists, of course he does. I don't think I had an understanding of the gospel or what Jesus Christ accomplished and what he did. I certainly don't think I ever had an understanding of my own personal sin, I guess. It was more like just abstract that God exists, and I can remember having conversations with my dad about trying to contemplate infinity, and isn't it incredible that you just can't possibly do that, and I remember having conversations about like, how is God omniscient, and how do we also have free will, like how do those things coexist. So I'm grateful, like there was some of that discussion, but it was kind of this abstract philosophical discussion. Like I don't feel like we were I was really grounded in the Christian faith. I really understood what it was all about.
So escape or transcendence, neither of those things would have been something that you experienced within the confines of Christianity within your
No.
earliest memories at the very
No.
least. Not a lot of that.
No.
Okay. So you become a young adult. How do you move from somebody who kind of woke up with a headache after a little bit of alcohol one night with some friends to somebody who starts to go down the path towards kind of intentional psychedelic use?
So I continued drinking recreationally throughout college, and it became a really destructive behavior. I was able to maintain my classes and my grades to a degree. I kind of abandoned the, good girl, grade perfectionist thing, but I was able to graduate. I was able to do what I had to do. And that slowly became, like I said, the drinking just became really destructive, made very bad decisions. And I started to recognize how destructive it was after a couple of years, and so I kind of retreated from it a little. I would still drink, but I felt like, oh no, I have it under control, And so I think there was a realization, like, this is not a good source of escape. Like, this is not a good source of transcendence, essentially. I don't know that I would have used the word transcendence at that point, but it was the spring of my last year, my senior year in college. I had a good friend who had some psilocybin mushrooms, and he had prior experience with psychedelics. They weren't really a spiritual path for him at that point, but he did have prior experience. And obviously I had no prior experience, but I was just open to anything. I thought, why not? Sure, I'll try it. And I hadn't read much about psychedelics. I mean, I knew they were, associated with hippies. But I guess I had some exposure through reading the Beat Poets and that kind of thing. But I just really didn't know about it. I didn't have any expectations. And that first time was really, I wouldn't say it was necessarily spiritual, it was just a really good time. It was very exotic, it was very colorful, very fascinating. I really enjoyed all of the auditory, auditory hallucinations, auditory changes. I really enjoyed all of the visual changes. I just thought it was just enchanting. I was really fascinated by it. And
this is mushrooms, right?
Yeah, mushrooms. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
It gave me that escape without the consequences of alcohol, and it was also it was like far more interesting than alcohol, because there was that visual and auditory component, and just felt like I was seeing everything in a new light. And of course, the next morning I didn't have a hangover, and I felt pretty good. And so
you remember it, is that right?
What's that?
And you remember these things, is that correct? The things that you experience when you're on, whereas like blackout alcohol, you might have pictures of it, you might have some like random memories, but you can't integrate it into your future going forward because you don't have any memories of it. But for the most part, you're able to maintain, at least this is my understanding, most of the impressions that you get while you're on psilocybin. Is that correct?
Yeah. I mean, there are times, like, if you took a really massive dose, I've heard of people blacking out, and later on with LSD, I had experiences where I'd say I probably, not necessarily blacked out, but just, I don't know, traumatic experiences. But yeah, that first time, I remembered everything. Like I said, I felt pretty good. I didn't have any regrets, certainly, the next morning. And so I would say at that point I was very intrigued. I wasn't necessarily, I still would have called myself an atheist. That first experience didn't change me that way, but I was very intrigued.
Okay. And that intrigue was enough to make you keep coming back for more. So one of the things that we hear about often gets talked about when it comes to psychedelics. You'll hear about people who are kind of like promoters of it, or whatever, people who are talking like the new, like, hey, this is going to be a phenomenal thing for us, and maybe we'll talk about some of the proposed benefits of the of kind of psychedelics later on in the conversation. But right now we'll just kind of say is often what gets said is psychedelics are not addictive, because things like marijuana, things like cocaine, well, marijuana also kind of gets, especially opioids, right? This is like the huge thing is we're talking about opioids are supposedly highly addictive. They are quote unquote chemically addictive. So this is why people sometimes can give up alcohol cold turkey, and then just for whatever reason will have to smoke for the rest of their lives. It's just like they just, for whatever reason, the nicotine, just they can't seem to get over it. And they'll kind of make a comparison. They'll say like some substances are not just pattern wise addictive, but they're chemically addictive. And the argument is that things like psilocybin, LSD, and other psychedelics are not that kind of addictive. Now, well, you can speak to whether or not that's true, but for whatever reason, you, after this relatively pleasant trip, decide that you would like to trip some more. So how does that progress for you in your life?
I sought out psilocybin maybe 2 or 3 times over the course of the next year, I think, and was able to obtain it, and just had what I would call a wonderful time. It still wasn't necessarily spiritual for me. There wasn't, I would say it was, like I said, transcendent. I don't know that I would have used that word at the time, but it was just, the intrigue, I guess, was deepened every time. I thought it was fun, and like I said, it was really appealing to me that it didn't appear to have the costs associated with it that alcohol did. And, but I'd say when it really became a spiritual pursuit for me was the first time that I tried LSD, and that was actually about a year after that first psilocybin experience, and I was looking for psilocybin. I think it was a year, maybe 6 months to a year, and I was looking for psilocybin. I couldn't find any, but I knew a man who said, well, I don't have any psilocybin, but I have LSD. And I thought, oh, well, same thing, whatever, same category. And so I thought, okay, sure, I'll do that. And he was more or less a stranger to me, which, looking back, this is extremely reckless to, invite him into my apartment and take LSD, a powerfully mind-altering substance with him. But I just didn't really have any sense of danger, and I really wanted another psychedelic experience too. So I think I was just willing to assume the risk. And that first experience with LSD, it was very different from psilocybin. It was not a party. It was not a fun time. I felt like I was atomized. Like I felt like I was destroyed. And so that really, at first, for a long time, immediately afterward, I couldn't decide if what I remember saying, like, I don't know if what just happened to me was a good thing or a bad thing. Like, I'm not sure if I'd ever want to do that again. And then I think 2 weeks later, I was looking for it again, because it was a really difficult experience, but it was just so outside of the realm of anything that I'd experienced previously, even on psilocybin mushrooms. And so that was very appealing to me. I wanted to see what else I could experience. I wanted to see what else there was in this realm beyond that I feel like I had touched for the first time.
And at this stage in the game, I mean, you mentioned the idea that you probably read Kerouac's On the Road, or you read some Allen Ginsberg, whatever. So, like, I mean, you know about this stuff, but you weren't really, even at this point in time, it sounds like anyway, you weren't in like a subculture of psychedelic users. Like you didn't have like a community of people around you or anything like that.
No, not really. Yeah, no, I really didn't.
You hadn't done a lot of research. So I'm wondering to what degree. I mean, one of the things we can sometimes hear about in these things is the value or importance of kind of set and setting. So, when you invite this random person into your apartment and you pop this piece of paper or whatever it happens to be into your mouth, like, to what degree are you taking care about the environment around you when you're having these kinds of early experiences?
Yeah, so definitely with the psilocybin experiences, I didn't necessarily have any sense of ceremony, or I came to have a very high sense of ceremony. But what was interesting about the LSD experience is that I really had no sense of that or consciousness around that. But the man that I was doing it with, he was all about set and setting. Like, he had read everything. He had read, Timothy Leary Ramdas. He had read everything, and so he brought all of these kind of like hippie accoutrements with him, and he kind of set things up for us. He was very ceremonial about it, to the point where it was almost intimidating. Like, it felt like there was a lot of pressure. I was thinking like, well, I just wanted to have a good time. I'm not really interested in all this stuff. And he really wanted to, like after the acid had peaked and we were kind of coming down on the other side, he really wanted to watch a movie called The Holy Mountain. I don't know if you've ever seen that or heard of it. It's kind of a favorite, I guess, within the psychedelic world. And it's a really strange movie. Of course, it became one of my favorite movies, and he was kind of explaining all the symbolism behind everything. And so that first trip, I didn't have the mindset. I didn't have like a, religious mindset going into it. But I was certainly surrounded by a lot of that, and I was with someone who had a very religious mindset about it. So all of that was really new to me. And then, of course, after that first time, I did become very, in a sense, very religious about set and setting and about having things just so. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. And then, would you describe yourself as maybe you wouldn't have used the word, but were you a materialist before this? So
yes.
You said you were an atheist.
Yeah.
Like, did you believe in an ethereal plane at all? Or would you have thought, no, it's just atoms, it's all there kind of is?
I was a materialist atheist. I would have called myself that, but I think there was part of me, I think there's part of everyone, I think there was part of me that longed for there to be more. Like, I remember actually shortly prior to that first LSD trip, I felt like I needed to be able to defend my atheism, and I was a really big fan of Christopher Hitchens, who of course was one of the four, figures involved in the new atheism movement in the early 2000s. And he had a new book coming out called God Is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything. And I thought, there was part of me that thought, like, this is going to be the key that unlocks everything for me. Like, this is going to be the thing that helps me kind of solidify my arguments for atheism. And I remember reading it, and I probably only got through half of it because I just found it so incredibly depressing and I think what it was is, like, he could not appeal to anything transcendent to back up anything he was saying. And when he did try to appeal to the idea of transcendence, it was like, well, we can experience, quote unquote transcendence through works of art and through literature. And I find it really interesting now he would, point to people like Dostoevsky, who is deeply religious, as someone whose works we can experience transcendence through. So even his idea of transcendence was materialist. And so I remember, just finding that really bleak and depressing, and that kind of threw me into a state of confusion. And I guess in a sense I was kind of ripe to interpret my LSD experience as that I had experienced something genuinely transcendent. I couldn't have said what it was or define it, but it certainly felt real. It felt like there was something beyond, like, the hard materialist atheist realm that I, on one hand, would argue was all that existed, but deep inside, I think I longed for there to be more. And all of a sudden it seemed like there was more. And so I wanted more of that. And the only way I knew how to get it was through the LSD.
Mm-hmm. Right. So, we keep throwing the word transcendent around. You can look it up if you don't know. But essentially just this idea that you said, like, that there's something more that you can transcend, you can go higher. Yeah. That's kind of what, it's not lower, it's not outside. It's actually kind of built right into the word in some respects, is like a spatial awareness that there is something higher than our kind of current existence. and that some people talk about, a sense of transcendence. I mean, as Hitchens himself was trying to describe in this book, right? Beautiful piece of music, wonderful work of art that you're kind of looking at almost as an icon. Yeah. Or listen, a beautiful fall day overlooking a canyon with, a bajillion colors. Right. You have this sense of like, oh, look, there is something more, something other. And so you are, in some respects, maybe finding this dead end of secular materialism to be just that, a dead end. And you're going, oh, look, here is this thing, this substance that is giving me a feeling of transcendence. Yeah. And now you have the ability to not only, it's not just a material, it's not something that you take, but it's actually a ritual that you can participate in, because set and setting, and it has, its own kind of holy scriptures in writers like Timothy Leary and Ram Dass, whatever, right? So now you have literally, in so many ways, become a devotee or a disciple of a religion. Yeah. And that religion would probably be something like psychedelics. Absolutely. So how long and how far? So how long do you participate in this religion, and kind of how far does it go for you?
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to go as far as it would take me. And so it was really over the course of the next, 7 years, I think. I think the last time I took psilocybin, I was 41 now. I was 29, 30. And yeah, it absolutely, as you said, it absolutely became my religion. It became the path for me. And it's interesting to think now, I would have said that I would have paid lip service to the idea of God. Of course, I couldn't define who that God was, and I couldn't even really be sure, especially after taking psychedelics for a number of years, that my God was had kind intentions toward me. But I wasn't really, like I said, I would pay lip service to the idea of God, and I would even use the word God. And I never felt, in the New Age world, and you'll see in psychedelia too, there's a lot of usage of the word the universe, kind of as a placeholder for God. People are comfortable using the word God, I guess. And people will say the universe, but kind of attribute the same, omniscient qualities to the quote-unquote universe. The universe taught me what I needed to know. The universe showed me this. The universe showed me that. And I just always felt like, that always felt hokey to me. And maybe it is because I was raised with God language that I was comfortable using that term. I was not comfortable defining it in relation to Jesus Christ. Like, as soon as someone started talking about Jesus, that would just kind of stop in my ears. I didn't want to hear it. But over the course of using psychedelics, and I find it interesting, I was rereading some things this morning in preparation for talking with you, and Thomas Merton actually pointed this out too. Like, when, for me, definitely God became a reality to be accessed, rather than any kind of person or deity that I was in submission to. Like, in a sense, I almost felt like I had some degree of control over God, even though with taking psychedelics, you never know what you're going to get. You might get heaven, you might get hell, you might, but I definitely, God was this reality to be accessed, rather than a person that I was seeking relationship with, or a person that I trusted in any degree. I loved LSD, but I wouldn't say, especially after, having some really traumatic trips, I wouldn't say that I ever really trusted LSD. And, but yeah, I would say LSD definitely became my God. I was extremely religious in relation to psychedelic trips. And like you said, there absolutely are, quote unquote, holy scriptures. Be Here Now by Ram Dass was probably my primary one. I look to that book for all kinds of wisdom. And yeah, it's definitely its own. And of course, there are people out there who take it just to have a good time. And I knew those people, and I was always kind of shocked, especially once I felt like I had discovered this miracle, and then I would talk to someone, and they'd be like, oh yeah, I took it a few times in college, and it was a good time, and I was just shocked. And I also felt like there was kind of like a sacrilege in that. Like, I was kind of scandalized when people would say that, like, well, like, this is my sacrament, like, this is my religion, and you're just using it to party. And I was kind of offended by that. But yeah, anyway.
How Rastafarians feel about marijuana, no doubt.
Right, sure, yeah.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Okay, so I'm realizing how quickly, because your story is so interesting, how quickly our time is going. I want to we're not going to leave off on the payoff of how you actually find your way towards Christ, because I think it's quite striking and beautifully told in the book. But I have, if you'll allow me, I have a couple of personal interests that I want to kind of dive into, and maybe this will be easy, maybe these won't. But right there, when you mentioned this kind of Thomas Merton kind of concept of the idea of God not being like a person that you're kind of in submission to, or even maybe necessarily a relationship with, but like a reality that's accessed. I wanted to know, you mentioned the sacrament of the psychedelic. As somebody who you have put in, obviously, not only much more thought, but have much more direct experience with this. For the record, I have never touched any psychedelics, and I don't intend to. Although I am, I always thought that they were just blanketly terrible. Like growing up, like I was like, oh, that's insane. Like who would ever do that? Because I remember hearing stories about people when I was very young who just had like, one bad trip and they're in the insane asylum.
Which is true. There really are.
Apparently, it really does happen,
yeah,
right? But now, so the data is giving us a lot of weird kind of new realities and new thoughts in the new world. Neither here nor there. A question that I have for you is, what's actually in the psychedelic? So you mentioned you take and eat, and you could get heaven or you could get hell. To what respect? In what respect is the substance just unlocking something that's present in you or in your environment? And in what respect is the substance actually bringing something to you? Yeah. So like the idea, what we call alcohol spirits, we still call alcohol spirits, right? And I was always told there's a reason why one person takes a drink and they're laughing their pants off, and another person is punching the person next to them, and it's because it's unleashing that which is inside them. And I'm just wondering, to what respect do these psychedelics, in your kind of understanding and experience, are they revealing something that's going on kind of in you and in your world versus actually inputting you kind of a script or some content to be run?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I do think there's some mystery there. I still wonder about some of the experiences I had, but I really think the answer is probably both. I do think that obviously I believe there's a spiritual realm, and I believe that in some degree that we can access that through psychedelics. And some people would hear that and be like, well, that sounds great, like why shouldn't we do that? Because I think we're not designed to bear the weight of that. Like, so anyway, to answer your question, I think it's definitely both. But yeah, I think it's both. Some mix of both, and where the line is within that, who knows?
Yeah, a little bit of mystery there. Like
yeah.
That's a good word on the idea of it. Just because it's there doesn't mean that you should use it. So the Garden of Eden classic. Hey, there's this thing there. You shouldn't pick that, because obviously this is what's of the earth is of the finest worth. This is the kind of the idea that some of these things are growing. Obviously LSD is not growing in the ground, but things like psilocybin, obviously, like these are marijuana. I don't really understand how the smoking toad, all this kind of stuff. I don't know how that's bananas to me, how anybody magically randomly discovered how to combine these things together.
Right?
But just the idea that they're there is not merely enough to say therefore you should go ahead and use them, right, because they're there. So
for sure.
And you mentioned Thomas Merton. One of the things that I do wonder about this is just going back to just the general idea of transcendence. So, how would I say this? I do think that maybe you talked about the idea that we're naturally wired for something. We're naturally wired, even when we try to deny the existence of God or whatever. We want to experience the idea of like, well, but when I die, there is something more. Or there's something more outside of me, like, because I can't be enough, right? So we're kind of like we're yawning towards something.
Yeah.
And so if we use the word transcendence for something, for people, transcendence maybe shows up in the idea of escape. So escapism is like, I want to feel something other than I'm feeling right now. So that could be, something from alcohol. That could be just the right series on Netflix. That could be just the right partner that I get a chance to hook up with later on tonight, whatever. But something that kind of like, it gives me kind of like medication to feel better. That's maybe a poor man's transcendence. Yeah. But that is nonetheless an indication or some kind of satisfaction of transcendence. Yeah. We would say those are not good ways necessarily of seeking transcendence, but that's not to denigrate the idea of it altogether. Sure. So the idea, I think people are in some respects, God, C.S. Lewis, we all have a sense of eternity, right? Yeah. So the hope for transcendence is maybe that's not a bad thing. It's a good thing. We could affirm that. Right. So we don't want to say you do it through psychedelics, but Christian tradition has a number of different ways that transcendence shows up, right? Like sometimes it's through the architecture in churches. Sometimes it's, maybe just through kind of holy adoration of like the Eucharist or whatever. Yeah. But there are like certain Christian traditions where people intentionally seek after, or well, how about this? They tend to experience transcendence through disciplines or means. Some might even go so far as to say techniques, but things like kind of intentional meditation, certain kinds of prayer of just kind of stasis prayers, whatever. Right. And so they're practicing things like breathing. They're these kinds of things, and in some respects, this does create in many people a sense of kind of transcendence. I'm reminded of the idea, maybe for these terms before, of the kind of like the right hand and the left hand techniques. Yeah. So like kind of like one being, the right hand techniques. I'm left-handed, sorry, but right hand techniques are supposedly the good ones. Those are the ones that we can affirm. Right? These are things like meditation, Bible reading, prayer, these kinds of things. And then left hand techniques are like maybe shortcuts or ways around it. And so things like psychedelics, right? Yeah. Like there are churches that we know, like that exist. Like in Canada, there's a church. I always blank on the name of it, but they use ayahuasca, and they're listed as a Christian church.
Oh, is it Santo Daime or Santo? Yeah,
I think that's right. Yeah. So like they will use ayahuasca as part of a ritual within their church services, right? I say this is at best a left hand technique towards some kind of transcendence, but. So without necessarily, fully denigrating and throwing it all away, I wonder now on the other side of what for you was just a blanketly negative experience with seeking transcendence through chemical means. Yeah. What's your current relationship with transcendence? So when you meet the no longer poor man's version of transcendence, when you encounter it, which I presume that you do in certain ways, how does that? Is that a complicated relationship for you at this point in time, or is it just it's all gravy? Or what are your thoughts on people who are seeking it in different through different means?
Yeah, it's interesting. After I have always been attracted to more charismatic versions of Christianity, and I've kind of had to temper myself a little bit with pursuing that too hard. And it's good that I'm married to a man who is the opposite, basically, and not at all attracted to charismatic versions of Christianity. But I think, you hit the nail on the head with like the left hand and right hand. Like there are biblically sanctioned ways of encountering God, and I think the key too is like those are ways that we still God is still in control. Like we're not imagining that we are somehow conjuring up God, through these things. Because sometimes you can pray and you don't feel God's presence at all. You can do these things, you can worship. I think a lot about what Paul said about like the sacrifice of praise. Like sometimes worship and praise is a sacrifice because you're not feeling it, you don't want to. So it's not like we're doing these things to like conjure up the presence of God, although that can be kind of a risk, I think, sometimes in some like super charismatic circles, is that it is almost, and I've been present at some things like that, and you get this disturbing sense of like we're trying to like wrestle up the presence of God, and there's just something off about it. But I would say I'm still very much I mean, I think we all long for an experience of the presence of God. Like we all long for, and it's sorrowful when it doesn't happen for a prolonged period of time. I always think about, I think it's from A Grief Observed, where C.S. Lewis talks about like, of course he was grieving, but like, you know, once upon a time there's like this, and I'm totally going to butcher this, I don't remember the exact words he used, but talks about like this mansion on the hill where it seemed like it was welcoming, it was brightly lit, like the doors were open, you could, you know, and now it just seems like that door is firmly shut and the house is dead. And of course that's where faith comes in, and I think it's good for us to have those seasons, and particularly I think it's been a good discipline for me to have those seasons and realize like after so many years of like, I almost to me like God was an experience. God was a state of consciousness. And yeah, so I would say I'm very attracted to those experiences. I don't think there's anything wrong or sinful with desiring a transcendent experience of God, but I think that key is in recognizing like the power is not with me. Like it's the grace of God if he chooses to give me a transcendent experience of his presence. And I believe he does do that often, but it's not for me to conjure up. And yes, there are these disciplines that I can use, but they're not even explicitly necessarily for the purpose of creating a transcendent experience, you know, or accessing a transcendent experience.
Yeah, that's good. That's a good word. So I think I read somebody the other day. It might have been Thomas Keating, I'm not sure, and he's a interesting character nonetheless, but he said something about kind of centering prayer, and he said, if Mary herself shows up to you during centering prayer, say, thank you for coming, but I'm not here to meet with you. Oh. And it reminded me of what people have quoted from certain Eastern fathers, which is like, as you're doing the disciplines, because they're disciplines, not techniques, so as you're participating in the disciplines of Christian worship and faith, when you receive manifestations, it's actually wiser for you to ignore those manifestations in some respects. So don't. Sometimes they will happen, but they are not, as you said, the actual goal. The goal is union with Christ. Right. So we don't want to be distracted by things that happen. Those sometimes can be a gift and grace that draw us onward. Yeah. Sometimes they can become something that I think I've noticed a propensity in myself and also in others to become addicted. To things that we wouldn't have thought could be addictive. Right. And so, so you, as a beautiful word about the idea of kind of, you know, what used to be a mansion, a light, is now kind of lights off. And actually, I think that's in some respects maybe a good connection to how you actually end up finding faith, right? Mm-hmm. So in the book, you tell the story of a friend of yours from high school who probably sent you an email, like a Hotmail account, because it was probably long enough ago that Hotmail is still a thing, and you kind of reconnect with this person, and they're sharing with you a little bit about their faith, and you're kind of, as they used to, I think, do kind of in high school, and it was kind of hokey, et cetera, but they go through a pretty dramatically trying time, and you notice something about that. Do you feel comfortable kind of just describing what happens during that time in their lives?
Yeah. So my friend Carrie, like you said, when she initially shared that she was, she had never left the Christian faith that she was raised with, but when she was in college, it was kind of, there was a reignition, I guess, and kind of claiming it as her own. And I remember her sending out that email, I think it was to the group of us, who used to be friends, and I just thought it was so incredibly hokey, and I thought like, oh, she's like retreating into the safety of this religion, instead of venturing out into the world. And so after we both had children that we reconnected. She invited me to her home so our children could play together, and it was maybe, it's hard to remember, maybe like 6 months to a year after we had started just like once every couple months getting together for a play date, that her daughter Joella, she had 2 children at the time, a 4-year-old boy and a 2-year-old girl, and her 2-year-old girl Joella started having just like a recurrent fever and some bleeding in her gums, and they couldn't figure out what was going on for a few weeks, and then finally they got a leukemia diagnosis, and it was incredibly fast. From diagnosis to Joella passing, it was 3 weeks, I think, almost on the dot. And so just this incredibly horrible, shocking, tragic tragedy, and I was just realizing at the time, and I actually around that time I became pregnant with our daughter, our second child, and I hate to say it now because I adore my daughter. I can't imagine my life without her. She's almost 13 now. But I really didn't want to be pregnant again. I didn't want to go through birth again. I didn't want to, I loved my son, but I wanted to have an only child. I just didn't want to do it again. I think I didn't want to make the sacrifice of pregnancy and birth again. And so that was, all these things were kind of converging at the same time. And I also was realizing, in the face of this incredibly heartbreaking thing, my philosophies and my, ideologies, which I had kind of cribbed together from different, traditions of Eastern mysticism and also my psychedelic experiences with those things would often kind of, dovetail together. I did not have a category or framework for redemption, any kind of redemption in the face of that level of suffering and that level of tragedy. And so that really shook me, just realizing this is someone so close to me. And there was also the aspect of like, this person is so, even though I didn't believe what she believed, I thought what she believed was kind of silly up to that point, I felt like this is a really wonderful person. She's lived a very upright, moral life. She didn't have sex before she got married. She just, her house is really clean. Like, she's just orderly. She does everything right. And so there was even some sense in me that like could recognize, I guess, like righteous living, or someone that was striving for righteous living. And by contrast, I felt like I was not. And so there was, I kind of expected, I guess maybe I expected her to be mad at God, or I expected her to rebel, or I don't know what I expected, but I just remember when we went to the funeral, I felt like she was almost comforting me, which was a really strange, and I mean, she and her husband were obviously heartbroken. They just lost a child tragically, totally unexpected. I'm sure they just had, they were in shock, but there was some quality in them that I felt like they were not completely destroyed. Like, they were heartbroken, they were devastated, they were grieving, but they weren't completely destroyed. And I think that just really got me thinking, her beliefs, which up to that point I just arrogantly dismissed out of hand, like, there's something that is sustaining her. And meanwhile, I have no idea how I would possibly be sustained in the face of something like this if it were my child. And even just seeing that it's someone else's child, I don't feel like my belief system can support this, like, I just don't feel like there's any pathway for understanding how this can be redeemed, or how you can go on living in the face of this. And so that really was, I guess I'd say that was a breaking point for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And your experience with ego death didn't make the loss of her child seem any less unjust or any more bearable.
No.
It wasn't like her atoms have gone back into the universe and it's all going to be good. Like, that wasn't your lived experience at that point in time.
No, not at all. All of a sudden, like, the thought of that, which I kind of just uncritically accepted, because like I said, it jived with my psychedelic experiences that were just, reabsorbed into the all, and isn't that wonderful? And we kind of we're just absorbed into this oceanic consciousness where we're not individual, our individuated existences anymore, and we no longer have our identity as an individual person, and isn't that wonderful? And it was kind of like that belief system colliding with reality, and me just seeing, like, I don't want that to be true.
So you tell a story of how at one point in time she had recommended that you check out this song. It's a hymn, a classic hymn, It Is Well, and which has an interesting backstory of its own.
Yeah.
So you end up throwing it on a playlist, maybe on, I don't know, it's on Spotify or whatever, but you put it on a playlist of some kind, and you kind of forget about it. And then one day, as you're kind of outside, I think you're playing in the front porch with your maybe two children now in
Yes.
the foreground, kind of
Yeah.
bodying around. The song kind of comes on, and would you describe maybe kind of how it's interesting to me that art, in some respects, kind of plays a bit of a role in this process for you. But yeah, what kind of clicks at that moment for you?
Yeah, I think it is so interesting to think. I don't remember that I was even really paying attention to the music. At that point, I still very much had, even though, like I said, things were really being shaken up for me, I still had one foot in the psychedelic world, and part of that was like just finding the most obscure lo-fi psychedelic rock, virtually unlistenable psychedelic rock that I could find. And so, that was mixed in on this playlist. And so I don't think I was even necessarily really registering it or listening to it, but it was the only way I can describe it. It was like the Holy Spirit just snapped me to attention. And I never really, despite growing up, like I said, somewhat in the Methodist Church, I don't remember ever hearing that hymn before, even though it's a very well-known hymn. Maybe I had and I just hadn't paid attention. But I think what really, I was just thinking about Joella, the little girl who passed, and I was looking at my own children, thinking about how beautiful they were, and what an undeserved gift they were to me, and particularly, feeling that, I guess, guilt about like how could I have ever thought I didn't want to be pregnant with my daughter, and she's so beautiful and perfect, and I don't deserve these wonderful children. And also just hearing the lyrics of and also knowing the backstory a little bit, that the man who wrote it suffered incredible loss, like I think just several days before he wrote it. And just thinking, the lyrics, when peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roar, like and thinking about all those things, like I said, in relation to my friend Carrie and her husband, and how they were sustained in the face of this immense, unimaginable tragedy. And it was like everything just converged at once. And I think at that point we were going to a church, but I was still struggling with like, I don't understand this. Like, this is language that I've heard all my life, and I thought I knew what it was all about. But I felt like I couldn't penetrate the mystery, and also there's also no let's see, like, how can I put it? No concept of sin in New Age theology, and I would say even in Eastern mysticism. Not that I was ever like a great scholar of any of that. I just kind of like took, it was like piecemeal here and there. But from what I understand, there's the idea that like, if there is sin, it's kind of this idea that we have become separated from what is true. And what is true is that, like individual existence is an illusion. And so, there wasn't any concept of sin. And I was really wrestling with that. Like, I don't understand why Jesus had to die for my sin. Like, that just doesn't really make sense to me. Am I really that bad? Like that kind of thing. And I've never murdered anyone. And, but there was just something, I think it was something about looking at my children, realizing, like I wrote a bit about in the book, we definitely slowed down with our psychedelic use and I was embarrassed to write about this. We slowed down with our psychedelic use when we had children. But there were a couple times when I took a small dose of psychedelics when my children were in my care. And I was thinking about that and looking at them like, wow, like I am a bad person. Like I'm not a good person like I think I am. Like, how could I be so reckless and stupid with these children entrusted in my care? And so, like I said, there were just so many elements converging at once, and I feel like the Holy Spirit was weaving it together. And when it got to the line, my sin, oh the bliss of this glorious thought, my sin not in part but in whole, I still get choked up, is nailed to the cross and I bear it no more. Like, I just felt like I finally understood. And it wasn't an intellectual understanding, like it wasn't this deep, I hadn't read a lot of theological texts. Like it was like I just finally understood. And it was a really profound and life-changing moment. And I remember when my husband got home from work that day, I just felt like we needed to get rid of all of our Eastern mystic bric-a-brac that we had around. We still had little Ganesh statuettes and Buddha statuettes, and I had icon of the Hindu goddess Kali, which is like a really super gruesome, quote unquote, god. And I remember she was kind of like my avatar for when I had a home birth with my daughter for when I was giving birth. And it was just astonishing to me to look at her and feel like, I can't believe I thought this demon, was ever going to save me or deliver me. And so yeah, that was, if I can look back and pinpoint one moment where I feel like that was my conversion moment, I would say that was probably it.
Wow, a transcendent moment, no doubt, but of a different kind of one that you couldn't have actually orchestrated, right? One
For
that
sure.
doesn't come in pill format or anything.
For sure. Yeah.
Gosh, I mean, and there's that, and there's so much more. That is only a high flying kind of overview of the book. I tell you what, if there's anybody who's interested in hearing a little bit more about, some of the, not really the pros, but definitely more of the cons of trying to take matters into your own hands and, trying to manufacture your own kind of transcendence, I would definitely recommend The Thing That Would Make Everything Okay Forever, Transcendence, Psychedelics, and Jesus Christ. But it's not just a cautionary tale, it's also a tale of hope, because there's obviously some wonderful, as we heard at the end there, some wonderful hope that comes out on the other end. What are your hopes for this particular book as it continues to make its rounds in the world?
I certainly hope that it would be encouraging to fellow Christians, even if there's nothing that they can relate to, even if they have no prior experience with psychedelics, just as a story of God's grace, and I hope too, I think when I was talking with my publisher and my editor about like how to present the book, like we didn't want to present it in a deceptive way to where people are going to automatically think like, oh, this must be very pro psychedelics. I guess there has been some confusion. I've heard from some people, if you just look at the cover, you might come away with that impression. If you read the back, I don't think you'd come away with that impression. But we did want to like kind of, I don't know, like cast a broad net. So maybe it's someone that would not be prone to pick up a Christian book if they knew it were a Christian, explicitly Christian book. Maybe they would be intrigued, maybe they would be interested. So that's certainly one of my hopes, that people who are maybe psychedelic curious or even pro psychedelics, that they would read it with an open mind. And it is very much, like we talked about, it is very much a memoir. Like it is very much my story. I'm not preaching, I'm not like, this is my story. This is what happened. And so I hope that both Christians and non-Christians alike would be willing to read it with an open mind. And I'm just trying to I'm a little freaked out about the vulnerability of it. When I got it in print form, I wrote it actually, gosh, it's been 2 years since I finished writing it. And I wrote it when I was pregnant with my now almost 2-year-old. And I'd kind of forgotten how I really just like spilled my guts. And so then when I got it in print form and I went back and read it, I was like, oh gosh. But I'm just trying to trust, that God will do with it what he will. So, yeah.
Yeah, vulnerability is, well, it makes one vulnerable. So prayers for that to be received well for you. And how many kids do you have now then, Ashley? Is that baker's dozen? Or?
I have 3, and I'm actually pregnant with our 4th. Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
mazel tov. That's great. Yeah, so like you said, maybe you have no interest in psychedelics. Maybe you've never experienced it. Maybe you don't know anybody who has. You know people who are interested in the transcendent, and you might well be one of these people. So being able to kind of wrestle with how people are looking for that in the real world, I think it could be beneficial for everybody. Ashley, thank you for your vulnerability, and thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you so much for having me.